Washington, D.C., 10 a.m. Monday. The James S. Brady press briefing room at the White House was packed wall to wall. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. This wasn't just another press conference. The presence of heavyweights like Caitlin Collins, CNN, Peter Baker, New York Times, Yamiche Alcindor, NBC, Jonathan Karl, ABC, and Ashley Parker, Washington Post, signaled one thing: this was going to be a showdown. At the center of it was Caroline Leavitt, 27 years old, the youngest White House press secretary in history. Just a week ago, the Trump administration had been hit with a barrage of legal setbacks, 15 federal injunctions in a single month, all aimed at halting executive actions deemed overreaching. Instead of recalibrating, Leavitt had gone on air attacking the judiciary, calling judges obstructionists. Her words had ignited a firestorm of backlash from legal experts and media veterans alike. Today, she walked in on time, dressed in a cream-colored suit, perhaps a symbol of neutrality. But in this political climate, it only made her stand out even more starkly. Her gaze swept across the room, gauging the temperature. She nodded once and said, "First question." Caitlin Collins wasted no time, raising her hand. "Miss Leavitt, last week you called the recent court injunctions completely absurd and unconstitutional. Are you suggesting this administration no longer recognizes the independence of the judicial branch?" Caroline didn't flinch. She leaned slightly forward into the mic, her voice crisp and deliberate. "We are fighting back using the full weight of the White House counsel's office and our federal lawyers, who believe these injunctions are entirely unconstitutional. Anyone with a basic understanding of the law knows that a low-level district court judge cannot file an injunction to usurp the executive authority of the President of the United States. That is completely absurd." Peter Baker from the New York Times flipped a page in his notebook and looked up. "Are you saying that rulings from federal courts, part of an independent branch of government, are invalid?" Caroline nodded slightly, continuing without hesitation. "As the executive of the executive branch, the president has the ability to fire or hire. And yet you have these lower-level judges trying to block this president's agenda. It's crystal clear. And as I just cited, I was appalled when I saw the statistic this morning. In 1 month, February alone, there have been 15 injunctions against this administration's agenda. In 3 years under the Biden administration, there were only 14 injunctions. The judiciary is being weaponized by political activists trying to undermine the president's executive authority." The room shifted, eyes darted, fingers flew across keyboards, tension thickened. Yamiche Alcindor leaned toward Ashley Parker and whispered, "She just denied the very principle of separation of powers." Ashley didn't look away from the podium. "No, she's openly declaring war on the federal judiciary." But Caroline wasn't done. She closed her point with a tone that sounded less like a press statement and more like a manifesto. "We are going to fight back. And anyone who has seen President Trump and his legal team fight knows how it's done. He was indicted nearly 200 times, and he's in the Oval Office now because all these indictments, all these injunctions, have always been unconstitutional and unfair. They are led by partisan activists who are trying to usurp the will of this president, and we are not going to stand for it." "No, thank you for the question. No invitation for follow-ups, just a cold, sharp full stop." From the side row, Jonathan Karl murmured under his breath, "She's not defending, she's declaring." Peter Baker, a veteran journalist not prone to provocation, spoke. "Miss Leavitt, the president has proposed increasing tariffs on imports, particularly from China and Mexico. You've stated this isn't a tax hike. Then who, in your view, actually pays these tariffs?" Caroline looked up. A brief silence, not hesitation, but calculation. She seemed to be measuring the depth of the question before launching her response. "The president is not implementing tax hikes. Tariffs are a tax on foreign countries, countries that have been ripping us off for years. Tariffs are a tax cut for the American people. The president is a staunch advocate of tax cuts. As you know, he campaigned on no taxes on tips, no taxes on overtime, and no taxes on Social Security benefits. He is committed to all three and expects Congress to pass them later this year." Some reporters looked down to scribble notes. But from the front row, Caitlin Collins raised her head again. More direct this time. "Caroline, with respect, Basic trade economics shows that tariffs are paid by U.S. importers. American businesses absorb those costs, not foreign governments. Isn't that the reality? Caroline didn't respond immediately. But before she could, Mary Claire Jelinek from the Associated Press leaned slightly toward her microphone, ready to cite figures from the Bureau of Economic Analysis. Caroline caught the movement and pivoted fast and sharp, cutting her off before she could speak. I'm sorry. Have you ever personally paid a tariff? Because I have. They aren't charged to foreign companies, they're charged to importers. And ultimately, when we have fair and balanced trade, which the American people haven't seen in decades, revenues will stay here. Wages will go up, and our country will be made wealthy again. And frankly, I find it insulting that you're trying to test my knowledge of economics and the decisions this president has made. Then she paused, locked eyes with Mary, who was still holding her pen, and delivered the final blow. I now regret giving a question to the Associated Press. The room froze. A handheld camera clattered to the floor, its fall sharp like a gavel strike. Yamiche Alcindor leaned toward Peter Baker, whispering, "She just blacklisted AP Live on air." Peter didn't respond. He scribbled slowly in his notebook, "Tariffs equals tax cuts for Americans," and underlined it in red. From the far side, Jonathan Karl pressed record. He didn't need to ask any more questions, he just needed to document history happening in real time. Caroline stood her ground, silent for a moment. She seemed to believe she had scored a win. But victory in the White House briefing room doesn't come from volume, it comes from surviving scrutiny. Ashley Parker finally spoke, measured, deliberate. "Caroline, can you name a single economist from the Treasury Department, or even conservative think tanks like AEI or Heritage, who agrees that tariffs are a tax cut?" Caroline blinked. A pause, not long, but long enough for everyone in the room to smell blood. And only then did Jonathan Karl speak. "Confirm you're not attending the White House Correspondents' Dinner this year, correct?" Caroline didn't flinch. She nodded and repeated her statement from the week before, word for word, like a preloaded round in a chamber. "I will not be in attendance at the White House Correspondents' Dinner." And just like that, the Sean Spicer show had its so-called breaking news. Silence followed, but in this room, silence was never empty. It was a loaded gun waiting to fire. Ashley Parker leaned in, her voice smooth as silk but sharp as steel. "The Correspondents' Dinner isn't a gala. It's not the Oscars. It's where presidents, from Obama to even Trump in his first year, have sat down and listened to jokes at their expense. Why does skipping it warrant breaking news?" Caroline didn't answer. She didn't need to. The pause was enough, a deliberate, measured refusal. Then came Yamiche Alcindor's question, slicing through the air like a scalpel wrapped in velvet. By skipping an event rooted in press tradition, is this administration signaling that it no longer sees value in showing up when laughter is unscripted? The Correspondents' Dinner has never been a coronation. It's a moment where power must sit, listen, and let the Fourth Estate have its say. Obama once joked he was Jack of all trades, master of ceremonies. Bush endured Jon Stewart calling him America's favorite accidental poet, and laughed along. Attending wasn't about obligation, it was about proving democracy could take a punch. But Caroline Leavitt's absence wasn't seen as a choice. It was a warning shot. Peter Baker muttered under his breath, low but deliberate, "If she can't take a joke, how is she going to handle the truth?" Just as the room settled, Caroline placed a firm hand on the podium and delivered her next statement with the precision of a guillotine blade. "We've updated the list of media organizations granted access to the White House press room. This restructuring reflects the information habits of the American people in 2025. These well-deserving new players will help spread President Trump's message." She didn't list the names. She didn't have to. Within minutes, the room knew. Associated Press, Reuters, Bloomberg, three pillars of global journalism, erased. Their replacements? Newsmax, The Blaze, One America News, outlets known not for holding power accountable, but for mirroring it back unchallenged. Mary Claire Yannick of the Associated Press raised her hand without standing, her voice razor sharp. "Miss Leavitt, why was the Associated Press removed?" Caroline met her gaze head-on. "We re-evaluated the standards of reporting. Some outlets no longer reflect the spirit of the nation." Mary didn't blink. "Is it because we refused to refer to the Gulf of Mexico as the Gulf of America?" As your office requested in an internal memo? A ripple of glances flickered across the room. Caroline didn't flinch. We expect media outlets to represent national identity with accuracy. If an organization cannot name the waters next to our homeland properly, perhaps they are reporting from a different map. Mary leaned in, no longer asking, now declaring. You don't want journalism, you want a soundstage, and you're turning the White House into a cable set for political theater. Caroline stepped forward, just slightly, not louder, just sharper. The Associated Press no longer has floor privileges in this room. Your credentials are under review. The air in the briefing room turned heavy. The kind of weight that doesn't press, it crushes. AP had never been stripped of its White House access. Not once, not in modern history. And now, with a single breath, it was gone. Caitlin Collins spoke next, voice steel wrapped in velvet. This is censorship. You're erasing access for independent journalism. Ashley Parker followed. Reshuffling seats to avoid difficult questions isn't what confident administrations do. We've reported through wars, impeachments, constitutional crises. Never has a press secretary expelled an outlet over a map label. Yamiche Alcindor sealed it. Ms. Levitt, this isn't just about who gets a seat. It's about whether this administration believes journalism is still allowed to exist. Caroline didn't waver. She didn't argue. She simply delivered the final line. Cold as iron. This is the White House of the American people. And they chose President Trump to help distinguish real news from fake. To some, that sounded like a mission. To others, it was a manifesto. The press had just been shown the side exit, not with force, but with the flick of a wrist and the ticking of a clock. Last night, on national television, Eugene Daniels, president of the White House Correspondents Association, said what others had only whispered. The public no longer trusts the Poole report. Not because they doubt what reporters see, but because they now know which reporters are allowed to see. This morning, Dan Balls of The Washington Post stood at the podium and delivered words like a gavel strike. If the executive branch gets to decide who reports the news, the press is no longer the fourth estate, it becomes a tool of control. And if the press cannot hold power accountable, then democracy is functioning with one eye closed. Caroline Levitt was still there. Impatient, fingers tapping, eyes flicking to the clock. No rebuttal, no counterpoint, just a single, clenched teeth statement. That is our decision. If there are no further questions, I'll be leaving now. And she stepped down, without waiting, without acknowledging the rupture left in her wake. No one spoke, but something unspoken surged through the room, sharp as glass, cold as stone, unallowable. A correspondent from MSNBC looked down at their phone and typed a single message to HQ, authoritarian press briefing. We need a live segment tonight. In the far corner, someone from NPR hit record again, slower this time. As if uncertain whether they were still covering a press conference or something else entirely. The White House briefing room had once been a front door for truth. Today, it felt like the press had been shown the emergency exit. Not with force, just a glance at the clock. Just a line that sounded less like a statement and more like a decree. We're done here. The White House briefing room went dark. Across the country, televisions flickered. MSNBC. 8 p.m. cool blue lighting. A glass desk. A voice, clear and commanding, cutting through the static. Joy Reid, veteran anchor, unflinching critic of authoritarian drift, looked straight into the camera. Tonight, this isn't about policy. It's not about polls. It's about power. Raw, centralized power. And what happened today at the White House should send a chill down the spine of every American who still believes in accountability. She turned to her left. With me in the studio, Chris Hayes, whose words from just hours ago are echoing like a rallying cry. Chris nodded, silent, focused. The battle lines weren't being drawn. They had already been carved in stone. He spoke with unshakable resolve, his voice like a verdict carved in stone. No kings, not ever. The weight of those words filled the air. Donald Trump doesn't just crave power, he wants a dictatorship. Modeled after Hungary, Russia, Turkey. And if we don't fight back with every peaceful tool we have, we lose everything. He let the words settle, then repeated them, slower, heavier, final. No, kings, not, ever. Joy turned sharply to her right. And now, joining us, is someone who was quite literally ejected from the briefing room today. Mary Claire Yannick of the Associated Press. The camera zoomed in. Mary didn't need theatrics. She had truth. Her expression was controlled, but her eyes burned with something raw, rage held in check. I'm not insulted because I was thrown out. I'm insulted that they think we don't belong there. They don't need to ban the AP outright. All they have to do is crack public trust. Just a sliver. And when that foundation crumbles, the propaganda empire stands tall. She paused, her voice tightening. I didn't go to the White House to be famous. I went to ask the questions that millions of Americans will never get the chance to ask themselves. And Caroline, she looked at me like a schoolteacher inspecting contraband. Like my presence was a flaw in her script. She didn't even hesitate. Your credentials are under review. Just like that, her voice dropped, cutting sharper than before. I'm sorry, but revoking a press badge because we wouldn't call the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America. That's not national security. That's micro-dictatorship. And it's growing. Chris Hayes sat motionless for a moment, his voice barely above a whisper when he finally spoke. History doesn't repeat itself exactly, but it whispers. And today's whisper was chillingly clear. When journalists are locked out, power rises to a floor with no stairway down. You don't need a coup to get a dictator. Just enough silence. Just enough people who stop speaking up. Joy Reid turned back to the camera, her voice steady, resolute. That's why we're here tonight. Not for revenge, not for ratings, but to say to America, you're not crazy. This is happening, and you have every right to be outraged. She paused mid-sentence. Something shifted in her gaze. She turned slightly, looking past the camera, through the studio's clear glass wall. In the far corner of the parking lot, under the flicker of a dying streetlight, a white Tesla smoldered, flames curling lazily around its hood. A thin column of black smoke rose into the night. A producer rushed past the frame, whispering off camera, Model X, fresh off the line. Joy didn't speak at first. She just watched. Then, her voice, quiet but razor sharp. A Tesla. Once a symbol of progress. Clean energy. Rebellion against the old order. Now, burning, 20 yards behind a newsroom that just got shut out of the White House. She turned to Chris Hayes, the soft blue glow of studio monitors flickering against their faces. Chris, she asked, voice low, like she was thinking out loud. That used to mean the future. What does it mean now? The silence hung heavy between them. And then she asked the question that cut through the noise like a scalpel. Are we just sitting behind glass, watching our society burn? And if we are, why the hell isn't anyone reaching for the door?